Us with, today, and we are extremely grateful that he is present amongst us. Peter Gray is an American psychology researcher and scholar. He is a research professor of psychology at Boston College. I think now you are retired, isn't it, Peter?
Retired from teaching, yes.
Yes, and the author of an introductory psychology textbook. He is known for his work on the interaction between education and play, and for his evolutionary perspective on psychology theory. So today he will be talking about self-directed learning. So let's hear from him, and let's give a round of applause and welcome him in this amazing conference. Thank you, Peter, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you all for being here. There is a handout for the talk, which I only unfortunately prepared yesterday. For those who are online, I put in the chat a link to the handout if anybody wants to download it. It's not necessary for you to have that in hand as I talk, but you might want to get it later on because it gives citations, references, documentation for the points that I'm going to make here. It also has an outline of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about right now. So I titled this, What is Self-Directed Education and How Do We Know It Works? So let me begin by pointing out that I am an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature. I'm interested in how that human nature came about by natural selection. And for most of the second half of my career, I've been primarily interested in the nature of human children, and especially in those aspects of children's nature that have to do with their education. We did not evolve as a species that learned through schooling. We evolved as a species that learned through self-directed education. And as a consequence of that, we have instinctive tendencies, especially as children, to educate ourselves. And that's been the focus of much of my research throughout the last 30 years or so. So I want to begin this talk by defining self-directed education. And I want to note that I use the word self-directed education rather than learning. Education is a kind of grander word than learning. Every animal can learn, but we are the animal that becomes educated. Education is more than just learning. An amoeba can learn, but we can become educated. So that's one of the reasons I prefer the term self-directed education rather than learning. It's a bigger statement to say that we can educate ourselves. Of course, we can learn by ourselves, of course. But the idea that we can educate ourselves is a more profound idea. So if in order to talk about self-directed education, I first have to say something about what I mean by education. So most people in modern cultures, when you ask somebody, if you were asked, you know, how educated you are, or to tell us about your education, you would respond in terms of the formal schooling you had, how many years of schooling you had, or what diplomas or degrees you've earned in schooling. We think of education in terms of schooling. But of course, if I'm going to talk about self-directed education, I can't be defining education that way. I think a far more meaningful definition of education than schooling is that it is the sum of everything that a person learns that enables that person to live a satisfying and meaningful life. That's what makes a person educated. You've learned what you need to learn to live the kind of life that you want to live. A satisfying and meaningful life. And sometimes I add to that a moral life, because ideally, all of us want people in our world, in our surrounding world, who not only are living a satisfying and meaningful life for themselves, but are concerned about other people, who are behaving in ways that that add to the lives of other people as well as to the lives of themselves. So that's what I mean by education. So if that's education, then what do I mean by self-directed education? I mean that education which comes from the self-chosen activities of the person being educated, that comes also from regular, everyday, daily life. Self-directed education can include formal lessons and classes if they're directly chosen by the learner, but most self-directed education does not come that way. It comes simply through living. It comes through pursuing our curiosity. It comes through conversations with other people. It comes through events like this one that I hope everybody who is here because you want to be here. This is self-directed education. So this is, that's what I mean by self-directed education. If you think about it, no matter how much schooling you've had, most of your education, in the way that I've just defined it, is self-directed. It's come from life. It's come from your own curiosity. It's not come from formal schooling. So that's self-directed. And for children, I might say the self-directed education comes primarily from freely chosen play, from exploration, from observation, from participation in everyday life. Self-directed education can be contrasted with imposed education. Imposed education is that schooling that is forced upon people, whether they want it or not. So self-directed education and imposed education are two very different things. Imposed education usually serves the function of trying to induce conformity. It's trying to make everybody the same. It's usually there's a curriculum and everybody's supposed to go through that curriculum regardless of their interests, regardless of their personality, their individual needs, their goals in life, and so on and so forth. So whereas self-directed education may lead us in very different directions, what's meaningful and satisfying to you may be quite different from what's meaningful and satisfying to me, which is why self-directed education cannot be measured. We're all on different paths in self-directed education. Imposed education aims at producing similar kinds of people out of all our initial differences, trying to iron out the differences among us and produce a kind of model that the creators of the imposed education have in mind as a result. Now, I also want to distinguish between self-directed education with small letters and self-directed education, capital SDE, capital self-directed education. I use the term, and the Alliance for Self-Directed Education uses the term self-directed education with capital letters to refer to those cases where a family has chosen for their child, or the child has chosen and the family has agreed, not to engage in imposed education. So these are people whose entire education is self-directed. They're not being required to do a formal curriculum. They're not being required to go to the state school, not being required to engage in activities for the purpose of education that are forced upon them, as opposed to activities that they have chosen to engage in. So that's what I mean by self-directed education. Now, of course, the legality of self-directed education varies from country to country across the world. In some places, it's not legal at all. Yet there are people who are doing it, perhaps underground in one way or another. In the United States, there are two basic legal ways to engage in self-directed education. One is by enrolling your child in a school that is designed for self-directed education, where there is no imposed curriculum, there is no testing, none of the trappings of imposed education are present, but there's plenty of opportunity for children to educate themselves within that setting. There are adults who are knowledgeable and can be sought for help. There are many other children that you can learn from over a wide age range. And you have ample time and opportunity to live a full life within this context and learn from that life and pursue whatever interests you desire to pursue. So that's one legal route. The other legal route is homeschooling. And homeschoolers who do not impose a curriculum on their child frequently refer to themselves as unschoolers. I don't particularly like that term because it's such a negative term. It sounds like you are doing you're not doing something rather than that something important is happening. I prefer the term home-based self-directed education. So this is the case where children are being legally homeschooled, but they're not being schooled in the usual way that we think of school. They're being, the parents and others are facilitating the young person's opportunities to pursue their own interests and learn in their own ways. So those are the legal routes for self-directed education in the United States. Now, I'm moving on, if you've got the handout, to be on the handout, the educative instincts that underlie self-directed education. When I say that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that children come into the world with certain instincts, which have come about by natural selection, that serve the purpose of education. And what I want to do is just run very quickly through. What are these instincts? What are these instinctive drives, these natural tendencies that essentially all children have, unless they've suffered a very, very serious brain damage? The first is curiosity. Human beings are naturally curious. That was the very first line in Aristotle's treatise on metaphysics. Human beings are naturally curious. Nothing could be truer about us. We are naturally curious. We are constantly wanting to know, wanting to understand. We look at things, we see new things in the world, we want to know what they are, we want to know about them, what can we do with these things? Children are especially curious. They're born curious. There's research that shows that newborn babies, as soon as their eyes can fixate, within hours of their birth, they're already looking around, examining their world, trying to figure out what's out there. As soon as babies can move around, we have to baby-proof our house because they want to get into everything. Why do they want to get into everything? They're exploring. What would happen if I dropped this vase on the floor? What would happen if I stuck a bobby pin in this electric outlet? They are curious. They want to, the reason they're moving around, the reason they're crawling around is because they want to get to things. They want to understand the world around them. And that curiosity doesn't die with age. We can kill it when we put children in school and their curiosity no longer counts. But if we allow children to continue to learn through their own exploration and curiosity, that curiosity does not die. It expands in the sense that they become curious about larger and larger parts of their world as they have opportunities to explore larger and larger parts of the world. So curiosity is the drive to understand, the drive to figure out what's there, the drive to know. There's two aspects to education. There's knowledge, and curiosity serves the function of acquiring knowledge. And there's skills. Play is the drive. Playfulness is the drive to develop skills. Play is doing things. Curiosity is exploring things. Play is doing things. And it's no surprise that natural selection designed children to play at the very kinds of skills that are important for them to develop to become independent adults as a result of their play. So anthropologists who've studied play in children throughout the world, and especially in cultures where children have much more opportunity to play than children do in the culture that I currently live in the United States, find that children everywhere play in certain similar ways. And I'm just going to list them. I'm not going to spend time because I don't have a lot of time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining these. But children play in physical ways. They chase one another around, they wrestle, they climb trees. This is how children develop strong bodies and graceful movements. This is, children are not designed to run around a track or lift weights or do these kinds of exercises. They're designed to chase one another around, laughing and screaming until their sides are splitting. And as part of this vigorous outdoor play, they play in risky ways. They climb trees maybe higher than their mom would want them to. They dive off of cliffs into water. They skateboard down banisters. They do all kinds of risky things. Why do they do that? Evolutionarily, the answer to that is because that's how children develop courage. That's how they learn, hey, I can do things that are a little bit scary and I can control my mind and my body while doing them. They're preparing themselves for future emergencies, not consciously. But that's the reason that natural selection endowed children with this drive to play in these kinds of risky ways. They play with language. I could elaborate on that if there were time. Children learn language in play. The initial cooing and babbling is playful. As they use their first words, they're using them playfully, not to ask for anything. And as they go on and play with others, they're using language to coordinate their play. So language is developed in play. It's not developed because we teach children how to talk or how to use language properly. It's developed through their own natural efforts. All children learn their native language through self-directed means. They play with imagination. We are the species that's capable of imagination. Imagination underlies our highest order thinking. Hypothetical reasoning is imaginative. What if this were true? What else has to be true? Children are constantly playing in this kind of way with imagination. Think about 3- and 4-year-olds playing around the kitchen table, and they're pretending that the kitchen table is a bridge and imagining that there's a troll under the bridge. And one child says, well, if there's a troll under the bridge, then we better give it a cookie so it doesn't eat us. That's hypothetical reasoning. Children are engaging in this high order reasoning, practicing reasoning hypothetically in this kind of play. Children play games with rules. We are the species that has to follow rules. We can't just do whatever comes to our mind or whatever whims and instincts we might have. We have to abide by the rules and norms of our societies. We couldn't have human society without that. And so it's not surprising that children all over the world play with games with rules, and that's how they learn to follow rules. That's how they learn what a rule is. It's also because they create rules in these games. That's how they learn how to create rules as well as to follow rules. And children everywhere in the world play at building things. Researchers call this constructive play. We're the animal with opposable thumbs that has, ever since we have been human beings, we have built aspects of our environment. We've built tools for hunting and gathering. We've built shelters to protect us from the elements. We've built means of conveyance, whether they're dugout canoes or whatever they are. We are the animal that builds things, and it's no surprise that children practice building things in their play, in their constructive play. We are the animal that uses tools, and children everywhere want to play with the tools of their culture. So children in hunter-gatherer cultures play with bows and arrows and digging sticks, and children in our culture play with computers, the primary tools of the culture. They're attracted to those things quite naturally because at some instinctive level, they recognize that these are the tools. If I'm going to be a successful adult, I need to become skilled at the use of these tools. And perhaps most of all, children play socially. They want to play with other children. Some kinds of play you want to do alone, but for the most part, children want to play with other children. And why is there this strong drive, this strong instinct to play with other children, ideally away from adults? Because adults interfere and prevent your natural interactions with other children. The reason natural selection created this strong drive is because the most important skills that human beings have to develop everywhere is how to get along well with other people. You could have a perfectly happy life without knowing how to read or write or do arithmetic, but you cannot have a happy life if you don't know how to get along with other people. You cannot have a good marriage, you cannot have real friends, you cannot have good work partners if you don't know how to get along with peers, if you don't know how to interact with other people in a way that pleases them as well as yourself. And this is something that children are constantly practicing when they are playing with other children. The most important ingredient to self-directed education is opportunity for children to play regularly with other children, because that's where they learn the most important human skills. So curiosity is how children acquire knowledge. Play is how children acquire skills, including social skills. The third innate drive that I've listed here relates to what I've just been talking about. I've called it sociability. And as it has, in relation to self-directed education, what I mean by sociability is the learning that occurs by our interactions with other people. Anthropologists who have studied children throughout the world have suggested that most learning, most of education comes in most cultures, especially non-school cultures, not from being taught, but from children's looking, watching other people, listening to them, overhearing. Your child will learn more by watching you, by overhearing you as you're talking to other people, than your child will ever learn by any lectures that you give to your child, any direct instruction you give to your child. Children, like all of us, are eavesdroppers. They want to understand people. They want to understand what's going on around them. They are driven to do that. That's the social part of education. And interestingly, children are also interested in sharing their knowledge. One child learns something, they want to show it, tell it to another child. So whatever one child learns gets spread very quickly to the whole group of children who are interacting with one another. Hey, look, I discovered these tadpoles down here at this pond. Come, let me show it to you. And now this knowledge about these tadpoles is not just one child's knowledge, it's lots of children's knowledge. And that comes from the sociability, the interactions among children. The third drive that I've listed here is what I've called willfulness. Children, of course, recognize that they need other people. They interact with other people. They're especially when they're young, they absolutely depend upon other people, their parents and other adults, for survival. But they also recognize at some instinctive level that ultimately I've got to take charge of my own life. I do depend upon other people, but I really have to make my own decisions. I have to take ultimately, nobody else is going to take responsibility for my life. They may be helpful, but I've got to take responsibility. That's why children, beginning around the age of 2, are already demanding that they do things for themselves when they can. No, I want to do this. I want to do it my way. Round two, young children's favorite word becomes no, much to the consternation often of their parents. No, I don't want to do what you're telling me to do. I want to do what I want to do. This, of course, can be a little disruptive within the family, especially in our modern culture, but we should look at this in a positive way. This is the child saying, I want to take charge of my own life. And we, as parents, should be allowing them to the degree that's possible to take charge of their own life, because this is how children grow up. And as they become older, they should be allowed to take ever greater independence, ever greater opportunities to be in charge of their own life. That's willfulness. The fifth thing I've listed here is planfulness, which is not actually an English word, but I've created the word. It really means the natural tendency to plan for the future. This is a more cognitive and slower growing instinct, if you will, but it is natural to all human beings to make plans. For young children, they're short-term plans. As soon as a child can play, a child can plan, because play requires a plan. I'm going to play this. That's a plan. And then you go ahead and you play it. As children get a little bit older and they're playing with other children, they may plan a little more distantly in the future. So imagine a couple of children who are making a sandcastle, and then their parents call them in for lunch and they say, okay, so after lunch, let's come back and finish this sandcastle that we're making. That's a plan for the future, not the terribly far distant future, but yet for the future. When children have lots of opportunity to make their own plans, when we're not making all their plans for them, but they're making their own plans and following through on their own plans, they become ever better at making plans. And ultimately, by the time they're teenagers, perhaps, they're beginning to think, you know, at some point I'm going to have to make a living. I'm not going to always be supported by my parents. How am I going to make a living? They're beginning to make a plan for that. And then they're beginning to think, well, in order to make the living that in the way that I would really like to make that living, how do I have to prepare myself for that? Do I need to go on to higher education? Are there other ways I can prepare for myself for that? And they begin to plan out their life in this kind of way. So those are the basic drives. And sometimes I add to that the drive to grow up. Children everywhere want to grow up. You know, the Peter Pan fantasy of the boy who never wanted to grow up, who wanted to be a child his whole life, that's an adult fantasy. That's not a child's fantasy. All children want to grow up. When they play make-believe, they all want to be adult characters. They want to be powerful characters. They want to be mommies and daddies and superheroes and so on. They don't want to be the baby. Somebody has to be the baby if they're playing house, but nobody really wants to be the baby. Everybody wants to grow up, and they play at adult-like activities. They play, hunter-gatherer children play at hunting and gathering and imagine themselves as adults in providing for the band in this kind of way. So I want to point out that these drives, which are the basic ways that children educate themselves, are all suppressed in our conventional schools. In fact, the first 4 of them can get you regularly into trouble in school. Curiosity leads you to ask questions that are irrelevant to the curriculum and being disruptive, and to pay attention to what's outside the windows rather than to what the teacher is trying to make you learn. Play, of course, is disruptive. It only occurs at recess for those schools that have recess, and that's not regarded as part of education in school. Playing in the classroom is disruptive to what's going on in the classroom and has to be suppressed. Willfulness just really gets you into trouble. It'll probably get you a diagnosis of ADHD in our culture today if you start acting in a kind of willful way. Sociability, you know, sharing your ideas, sharing your test answers, and helping your classmates, that's cheating in our public school system. And the plans are primarily being made for you. You're not planning your curriculum. You're not planning your future when you're in school. You're just trying to carry out the plans that have been made for you by somebody else. So all of this, all of these drives, it's very interesting. So what our schools do is they take those drives that came about in natural sections for the purpose of education, and they throw them out the window. We're not going to allow any of this. Here, we're going to make you learn, and we're going to use reward and punishment as our means of making you learn. That kind of learning leads to very shallow learning. It leads you to learn what you need to know to get the reward and avoid the punishment, to get a high score on the test. It does not lead you to develop deep interests in these things. Very rarely does it do that. And it does not lead you to incorporate this information in a way that's a meaningful part of you, that stays with you, that becomes part of your real education as I defined it at the beginning of this talk. So now I'm moving on to the question of the question of self-directed, of how do we know that self-directed education works? I'm going to have to speed up a little bit because I'm noting the time here, and I'm going a little slower than I should to finish this talk. So one of the ways I've looked into self-directed education is by surveying anthropologists who have lived and studied with hunter-gatherer cultures in various parts of the world. And I'm going to be very brief here, but what I learned from that is that in these band cultures, children are allowed infinite time to play and explore. There seems to be an understanding among hunter-gatherers that this is how children learn. There is essentially no teaching, a little bit like, you know, those mushrooms are poisonous. Don't eat those mushrooms. Things like that. They will teach their children about those things that are really dangerous. But they don't teach them how to hunt. They don't teach them how to gather. They don't teach them the dances of the culture or the music of the culture and all of that. They just understand children are going to pick this up. They're going to learn it. They're surrounded by it. Of course, they're going to learn it. Part of the ethos in these egalitarian band hunter-gatherer cultures is you don't tell other people what to do. Willfulness is the drive that motivates people, including children in such cultures. I learned this from all of the anthropologists that I surveyed. And so these drives, it makes sense that these drives that I've just described would have come about in the course of natural selection. We were all hunter-gatherers during the great bulk of our biological evolution. Agriculture is only about 10,000 or 11,000 years old. So for roughly 100,000 years that we were Homo sapiens, before that, we were becoming educated through the natural means that I've just described. So then the question arises, well, how do I know that this works in our culture? So maybe these natural ways of learning worked very fine in a hunter-gatherer culture. Maybe they're good ways of learning how to hunt and gather and do the kinds of things that hunter-gatherers do, but maybe they're not good ways to learn how to read and write and do arithmetic and do the things that are important in our culture. There are, in fact, some evolutionary psychologists who argue that, well, we need schools because there are certain kinds of skills that are not part of hunter-gatherer culture, and we don't have instincts to learn those skills. And these include reading and writing and mathematics and formal science and those kinds of things. So we need schools for that. It turns out from my studies that I've become convinced we don't need schools for those things. As long as children are exposed to these things, as long as they see that these are meaningful parts of life and for the kind of life they want, they will learn it, and they will learn it in the same natural ways that they learn everything else. Well, how do I know this? My initial studies, begun really 40 years ago, were of graduates of the Sudbury Valley School, which is a democratic school in Framingham, Massachusetts, which my own son went to. And it was that school that first got me interested in self-directed education. I mean, here was a school where there were plenty of children, age 4 on through high school age. There were some adults hired as staff members at the school. There was rule of law at the school, but the rules were made democratically by vote that included the students as well as the staff. But there was no imposed education. There was no imposed schooling. There was no curriculum. There was no testing. The children had all day long to pursue their own interests. It was exactly the opposite of what we think of as school. And so here I had my son going there because he wouldn't go anyplace else. He rebelled at regular school. I was kind of blackmailed into this in a sense, because my son absolutely insisted that he was not going. He was going to rebel continuously if I kept making him go to the regular public school. So here he was, and I was curious about what's going to happen to him. Is he going to be able? So I was happy. He was happy there. I was delighted about that. But what about his future? So I did a study of the graduates of the school at that time, and that's what really changed my career. Here was a group of young adults who had not done what we usually think of as school. And they were out there doing very well in the world. Those who wanted to go on to higher education went on to higher education. They didn't have any difficulty doing it, and they did well in higher education, even though they hadn't taken any of the courses that colleges say and universities say you have to take in order to get admitted. Somehow they got themselves admitted, and then they did well. They were in the whole range of careers. I was initially a little concerned maybe they all become starving artists and musicians, because why would they get interested in anything else if they're free to do what they want to do? But no, they were in the whole range of careers. They were in helping professions. There was a lawyer in the group. There were people, there was not in my initial study, but later on, there were doctors, there were scientists, there were lots of business people. I could not see any career that is valued in our culture that there weren't at least some of these graduates pursuing. So that convinced me that it works. And that led me to this whole question of, well, why does it work? And it led me to develop this biological theory of education that I've just described to you. I then went on to, along with a colleague, Gina Riley, to study unschoolers, home-based, self-directed education, and found very similar findings with them. That they too went on to higher education if they wished. They too were in the whole range of careers. One of the things that I found in both of these studies of grown people who were self-directed education is that most of them were in careers that they loved. And the reason they were in careers that they loved is they developed real interests, real passions through their play when they were young people. And then they figured out a way of making a living, doing what they really liked to do. They weren't so motivated just for money. They tended to choose careers, given a choice between a career that would make more money, but this would be kind of a boring and meaningless career for you, and a career that would really be fun and meaningful and some kind of contribution both to my own development and to the development of the world. They would choose the latter more often than my other students at Boston College would, who would more often choose the more prestigious and higher money-making career rather than the career that would give them more personal satisfaction. So that was one of the characteristics that seemed to be true for both, for all of the, for the large majority of those who had been engaged in self-directed education as their education. Now, finally, I want to very briefly list what I believe are the optimal characteristics of an environment in modern culture for self-directed education. In the hunter-gatherer culture, self-directed education is natural. You're surrounded by other people all the time. You can't help but see what adults are doing. There's no privacy in a hunter-gatherer culture. You can see how people hunt. You can see how they gather. As soon as you're old enough that you're not going to disrupt the hunt, you're invited to go along with the hunt if you want to do it. You're always invited to go along on the gathering trips. You see firsthand how arrows are made, how hunts are built, and you because you're a child, you want to help out, and hunter-gatherers allow you to help out, even if it slows them down, because they recognize that this is one of the main ways that children learn, is by helping out, and even when they're too young to be real help, they're allowed to help. So in a hunter-gatherer culture, there's no trick to providing the conditions for self-directed education. But our culture is different from that. We isolate children in nuclear families. Very often children don't even really know what their own parents do to make a living, let alone what other people do to make a living. There are many more different ways of making a living in our culture than there are in hunter-gatherer cultures. And there are aspects that are to our culture that not all children would be naturally exposed to. So if your family is not big readers, your parents are not big readers, you may not grow up seeing that reading is really quite a valuable skill. And I could go on and on with that kind of thing. So if we want self-directed education to work in our culture, we can't just send our children out in the street and expect that they're going to be educated in a reasonable manner. We have to provide conditions that allow that to occur. And here is my list of what those ideal conditions are. The first is the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility. We can't, out of one side of our mouth, say, you're responsible for education, and then out of the other side of our mouth say, so now to become educated, you have to do this and this and this. We have to back off. We have to make this a reality. One of the characteristics of a Sudbury school, of a school for self-directed education, is there's no pretense that the staff members are there to educate the children. No pretense. They don't call themselves teachers. They don't even call themselves facilitators. They simply say, we're the adult members here of this culture, and the adults can be contacted, but your education is your responsibility. There's no pretense that I'm here to educate you. I'm here to be a tool for your education if you want to use me. But there's no requirement that you use me. So that's the first character. The second characteristic is unlimited freedom to play, explore, and pursue your own interests. Self-directed education takes time. It takes free time. You need lots of time to play, lots of time to explore in order to educate yourself. That children in hunter-gatherer cultures have that time. Children in our in Sudbury model schools, other schools for self-directed education have that time. Children in home-based self-directed education have that time. Children in our typical schools and our typical families don't have that time because their time is taken up by all sorts of adult-imposed requirements and activities. The third characteristic is opportunity to play with the tools of the culture. So you're not going to be able to learn how to use the technology of your culture, whether it's bows and arrows and hunting sticks or whether it's computers, if you're not allowed to play with those tools. And by play with those tools, I mean do your own thing with them, not just do some exercises with them that you're told to do by a teacher. It really means play. Do your own thing. Make this part of you. Hunter-gatherers, in hunter-gatherer cultures, I've seen films of toddlers, 2-3-year-olds playing with fire, playing with machetes, playing with bows and arrows. They don't play with the poison darts. Those are kept way away from them. But playing with things that we would probably not allow our children to play with because we think they're dangerous. But hunter-gatherers say, you know, they're not going to be able to learn how to use these things if they can't play with them. This is how they learn. And they're not going to kill themselves. They may get a little burn if they're playing with fires. They may get a little scratch if they're playing with a machete, but they're not going to kill themselves doing that. And most kids do have some scars from such play, but to deprive them of such play would be far more cruel than to prevent them from getting these little scars by preventing them from such play. So that's part of it, allowing children to play with the tools of the culture. In our culture, the primary tool is computers. And yet I hear of parents who don't let their children play with computers, even though this is the primary tool of our culture today. Access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers and not judges. This is a challenge for home-based self-directed education. It's not enough that your child just sees you. No matter how wonderful you are, you don't represent all of adulthood. Children need to get a sense of what it is to be an adult, different kinds of adults. Even if you're a wonderful adult, they may not want to be exactly like you. They want to have various adult models to pursue. And so it's important that in a school for self-directed education, there be a variety of adults. They have different kinds of personalities, different interests, and so on. So children can get a sense that there's a lot of ways of being an adult in our culture today. For home-based self-directed education, it's very important that the parents make sure that there's a community of adults that the children have access to, and it's not just them. So that's, and I've also said that these are caring adults. They care about the child. They're willing to respond to questions. They like the child. They support the child and the child's interests. But they're not judges. You can't really be yourself in interaction with somebody else if that somebody else is judging you, is evaluating you. You're always kind of on impression management mode when you're with somebody like that. So to have a genuine relationship with somebody, you have to be convinced that that person is not judging you, not measuring in any kind of way your progress, but is simply accepting you for who you are. That's sometimes hard for parents in our culture today, but that's something that for self-directed education, parents have to do. And similarly, in schools for self-directed education, it's important that the staff members not be evaluating the children, that the children are evaluating themselves. That doesn't mean that a child can't come to you and say, so, you know, what do you actually think of this essay that I wrote, or this poem I wrote, or this picture that I drew? And that child wants an honest answer. That's different from imposed evaluation. That's where the child is saying, you know, I genuinely would really like constructive criticism on what I'm doing here. How could I be doing this better? That's very different from your imposing judgment on the child that the child has not asked for. The fifth characteristic is free age mixing among the children and adolescents. Daniel Greenberg, who founded the Sudbury Valley School, very often said that the key to why the school works is the fact that the school does not segregate children by age. Younger children are constantly learning from older children, partly by simply watching them, observing what they do, and then the younger children want to do those things, partly by playing with them, where the older children are boosting them up into higher levels of activity. And the older children gain from interacting with younger children. They learn to be leaders, they learn to be nurturers, they get a sense of their own maturity by recognizing, hey, I'm not somebody who just depends upon other people. I'm somebody who can be actually helpful to other people. That's an important part of self-directed education. And then finally, immersion in a stable, moral, and caring environment. And I sometimes use the word democratic environment, especially if we're talking about a school, that the school is run democratically and not by dictatorial methods from the leader of the school. So, and why is that part of it? It's because I think that we want children to become educated not just for themselves, but also for the community, also to develop a sense I'm part of a community. It's very important to me that the community works, that I am helpful as well as being helped by the community. So it's important that children not develop in an isolated nuclear family, but rather that they develop in a community, whether that's a school community or whether it's a neighborhood community or some other kind of community that the parents might be part of and other people are part of. This is also very important to self-directed education. So I'm going to bring it to a close now and turn it over to questions. We've got at least a little bit of time, I believe, for questions. Simply concluding that might add that my research in self-directed education led me ultimately to become not only a researcher curious about how it works, but also an advocate for it. It's hard to see this. It's hard to be enlightened in the kinds of ways that my research and other people's research has enlightened me about self-directed education, not become an advocate. I've also written a great deal, I'm not talking about it here, written a great deal about the harm of imposed education. There's no question but what this is creating extreme damage to young people, the kinds of, and especially today, where that imposition, at least in the United States and many other developed countries, has become ever more rigid, ever more judgmental, ever more test-based, ever more anxiety-provoking. We're seeing record levels of anxiety, depression, even suicide among school-age children in the United States. I've just written and published on my Substack an article in which I present multiple lines of evidence that the sharp rise we've seen in mental breakdowns and even suicide among young people in the United States corresponds with the changes in education, the greater rigor, the less creativity, the removal of play from schooling, that has resulted from the No Child Left Behind Act and Common Core of the United States, which has made education even more rigid, more stressful, less enjoyable than it was before. So let me conclude now and turn it over to whatever questions you might ask. And I would ask, if you raise a question, try to articulate very clearly. My old brain doesn't deal well with understanding language unless it's clearly articulated.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, very much. Thank you so much. We are on the 5th day of the IDEC conference. So let's get some questions. Ruud, yes.
Hello, Peter. I'm Ruud from the Netherlands, and we have a democratic school for 20 years now. My question is, the inspection is quite all right with what we do, and the way you explained it, we can explain that to them too. But there's one thing we can't overcome, and that's their desire or their demand that we have to prove and show their development in a linear way, in language and math and the basic skills for a good civilian. So my question is, should we continue to find ways to do that, or should we continue to make them understand there's no need and we're doing fine as we go?
I understand that dilemma, that problem. I've been involved in discussions even with education, people involved with the education system in Germany about that very same issue in Bavaria. There's this belief that it's the job of the Department of Education, of the people who run the education, the state or national education system, to evaluate education. And what I've always argued is there's only two ways to evaluate an education system. The first way to evaluate it is by looking at the children. Are they happy? If they're not happy, your education system is a failure. If they're happy, that's an indication it's working. So any education, any school, any system of education that makes children unhappy is automatically a failure. The best predictor of a good future is that you've had a good childhood, that you have enjoyed life as a child. That leads you to enjoy and find meaning in life and contribute to life as an adult. That ought to be the #1 way of evaluating any school, any education system. Are the children happy? That's what evaluators ought to be concerned about. If the school is making children miserable, it should be shut down. All right, so that's #1. The #2 thing that you want to know is, are the graduates of this education, are they okay? You know, are they contributing to the society? Are they making a living? Are, you know, it's the state is concerned. They want the graduates to be taxpayers. They want them to be part of the economy. They don't want them to be in mental hospitals or prisons. And so the other way of evaluating any educational system is a long-term system. You can't do it on a day-to-day basis. You have to wait until there are graduates, and then you do the kind of study that I've done with Sudbury type schools in the United States, with unschoolers. You do the study. Are they in some sense wards of the state, or are they people who are contributing to the state? And if you find that they're doing okay, they're doing at least as well as the kids who have gone through the state imposed system, that's proof, you know. So those are the only 2 ways. As soon as you try to evaluate it by measuring in some ways what they're learning along the way, you've destroyed self-directed education. It's no longer self-directed education.
Thank you. Peter, shall we take another question? Because we have limited time, about 10-15 minutes.
Thanks, Peter. This was a brilliant talk. This is the first time I've heard you speak, and I'm part of a democratic school in Mumbai. So my question is, your theory is so convincing to me about self-directed education. Like, what is the best criticism you have heard about your theory, and best criticism against self-directed education?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The best criticism of what?
The best criticism of your theory, the best criticism of self-directed education.
The best criticism of self-directed education. Well, I would say that the criticisms that I might have of self-directed education have to do with the pretense of self-directed education when it's not actually self-directed education. I think that if one is doing what I've described, that's self-directed education. I do think that there are people who, especially among the unschooling group, who carry their philosophy to a point that I disagree with. I understand what they're doing, but I personally disagree with it. There are some people who believe that if you are an unschooler, you would really completely allow your child to do whatever the child wants. I think that children need to grow up understanding that there are limits on what they can do. Understanding, as Neil put it, understanding the difference between freedom and license. You don't have the freedom to do things that hurt other people, that disrupt other people. You don't have the freedom to disrupt a restaurant by being noisy and running around and disturbing other people's lives there. You do have the responsibility in our family of helping out in the family, you know? You should be helping with the washing dishes, making dinner, painting the house when you're old enough to do that. Most children want to do these things, right? But there's a kind of sense that we should never ask our children to help out. That's different from asking them to read a book for their own educational purposes. We should have the expectation that children be concerned about other people, and that they are, if they're part of the household or they're part of the school, it's their responsibility to contribute in a meaningful way to the household and to the school. So at a school like Sudbury Valley, there are clear rules. This is not anarchy. This is a rule of law. The kids have a voice in those rules, but once the rules are made, they have to follow them. Even if you're 4 years old and you leave your toys out, you'll be brought up to the Judicial Committee for leaving your toys out. There was a rule: if you take something out, play with it, you have to put it away. And, you know, there might be adults at that meeting who will argue, well, he's only 4 years old, but there'll be somebody who's 5 or 6 who says, well, when I was 4, I could put my toys away. You know, so there's expectations as well as freedom. It's freedom, not license. And I think when you go to license, that's when you've gone too far with the idea of freedom. We're not totally free. We have obligations to the people that we're with.
One more question. Thank you. You said no children have Peter Pan syndrome, but I heard, maybe only in Japan, I heard from some kindergarten teachers saying that when they play house, there are more kids want to be a baby or sometimes even pets. So I assume that's probably because they're under too much pressure, so they want to be treated like a baby. So how do you think about this? And also, when they want to be treated like a baby, do you think we should treat them like that?
Could you just repeat the essence of the question one more time? And again, I apologize. I have difficulty sometimes understanding.
Yeah,
just the
said,
essence of the question.
Okay, you said there's no kids with Peter Pan syndrome. Every kids want to be adult, right? But yes. I heard some kindergarten teachers saying when the kids playing house, many kids want to be baby. And many kids want to be even pets.
Okay, so some kids do want to be the baby or the pet. You know, the examples I gave, it's usually, oh, you have to be the baby or you have to be the pet. I want to be the baby or the pet. That's great too. You know, it's we all like to be babied and petted at times. You know, if I were playing house, I might prefer to be the baby or the pet, you know, rather than to be the one who has to take care of everybody else. So I think that's perfectly acceptable. I gave that example because I think in general, kids, when they're playing at fantasy games, want to play the more powerful part. I still remember, you know, lots of playing house when I was 5 and 6 years old and in the neighborhood, and there were girls and young kids, boys on the street, and we'd play house. And I would usually be the daddy because I was often the only male involved, and somebody had to be the baby. There was somebody who was my wife, the mother, you know, and we played that way. So I'm partly thinking of that when I'm thinking of this. In my memory, nobody wanted to be the baby, but I could understand somebody wanting to be the baby in a game like that. There are times when, you know, I would love to just crawl up and be the baby. I see that Derry has his hand up. I don't know if...
hello, hi. I'm a student teacher. I'm in my 4th year of a degree to teach English as a foreign language. I live in the Netherlands, but I'm English. My question is, well, firstly, I've read your books and I cite you regularly when I have to make portfolios for my degree. But there is very little methodology for teachers in terms of, we need to train more teachers to work in democratic education. And okay, for primary level, it's not so, there isn't so much pressure, but for example, if you want to prepare or to facilitate a student to be able to take exams so they can go to university, it's, you know, there is teacher training necessary, especially in the Netherlands, where legally they need to have teachers like that in school who can do that. Is there any, do you know of any methodology, or would you be interested or willing in to create a methodology as teacher training?
So I think that it's really not a matter of teacher training. So self-directed learning of a foreign language occurs when the child wants to learn the foreign language. If the child doesn't want to learn the foreign language and the course is foisted upon them, it's not self-directed education. A child who wants to learn a foreign language probably wants to learn it in the most efficient way possible. So if you are skilled at teaching that foreign language, that child wants you to use whatever skill you have in teaching the foreign language. They don't want to mess around. They want to learn the foreign language. And if you have a very efficient way of doing it, they're motivated to do it. You don't have to motivate them to do it. That's part of self-directed education. Is motivation is not a problem for the adults. It's the motivation comes from the child. So that's true for foreign languages. It's true for anything else. I happen to remember when my own son started at Sudbury Valley School, the one course they had was in a foreign language. I think it was French. And I think my son, because he probably felt he ought to be in his course, some course, or else his dad would be disappointed, joined that French class. And at some point, the person, and this was a group of people who really wanted to learn French, but my son was there not because he really wanted to learn French. He was there because he wanted to please his dad, who he assumed would be disappointed if he wasn't taking that course. Well, it soon became clear to the person who was leading that course that my son was holding everybody back. He wasn't really interested in it. He wasn't doing the homework. And so they said to him, you know, you don't have to take this course. Why are you here? You're clearly not interested in learning this foreign language. That was a relief to him. And I told him, I don't care if you learn French, that's your business. You know, I took lots of French in school and I can't remember a bit of it. So unless you just really want to learn it, there's no point in being there. That was a great relief to him. I know kids today who learn foreign languages because they're playing video games in a foreign language, or they're communicating with kids. You know, some of them, I know one who's now a young woman, but she learned this when she was a girl. She got really interested in anime and Japanese cartoons and Japanese art, and she was on Japanese sites so much that she learned Japanese. And then by the time she was 12 or 13, she was actually teaching Japanese to other kids who wanted to learn Japanese, primarily because of what they were getting on the internet from Japan that was fascinating to them. And they didn't want to just hear the English translations of it. They wanted to hear the original Japanese. That's real self-directed learning of a foreign language. I think this is occurring more and more because of the internet, because we're kind of, even in the United States, where almost nobody learns a foreign language because everybody can speak English elsewhere, and so we get along, unlike other people. So we don't have to become bilingual, and we take selfish advantage of that, as I am right now. Children are increasingly connected, even in the United States, to people who speak other languages, and they're increasingly wanting to learn other languages, and they're learning them in rather natural ways.
But how do we facilitate as teachers? Because coming into the school, it took me, I had to unschool I'm a parent now as well, I had to unschool. But to find the methodology to the things that you're saying, for example, it took me a while to, I came in with my own preconceptions, and it's taken me a long time to be able to, even with all the reading I've done, to be able to do what you're saying, to be able to say to them, look, I'm not going to teach you the basics. Go off and read, go off and play, go off and do things in English. If you're interested in learning English, there are plenty of ways to do that. And, I can suggest ideas, but there is that unschooling process. So the teachers have got to go through that as well. And I think the things you're saying, for the teachers to come and want to work in democratic education and so on, be nice to have.
So let me be clear. I am not opposed to formal courses. I am not opposed to a straightforward course in a foreign language. taught by people who've learned how to teach that foreign language. I'm not opposed to that. I think it's a good thing. Many children want that, choose that. What I am opposed to is forcing that course upon a child who doesn't want it. When children in self-directed education want to take a course, they don't want to mess around in the course. They don't want to say go out. They don't want the teacher to say go out and play. They want the teacher to teach them what they want to learn in that course. And if they want to learn French, they want to learn French. If they want to learn algebra, they want to learn algebra. So the teacher who's been trained to teach that stuff, teach it in the way you've been trained to do it. There's no special self-directed education way of doing it. Self-directed education, but what I'm saying is there's different ways that children choose to learn things. Some of them want to learn it in a course. You know, at Sudbury Valley, there are always children who at some point in their time want to learn the mathematics that they need to do well on the math SAT, if they see that as part of applying to college. They want a course on that. And they don't want the teacher to say, now go play with these numbers. They want the teacher to teach them algebra, to teach them geometry, to teach them trigonometry, or whatever it is that they have to learn in a straightforward, no nonsense way. I think we make a mistake in self-directed education if we think that it's self-directed education if we make it playful and fun and so on and so forth. Children want play and fun, but that doesn't have to be part of what they're learning when they definitely want to learn something. So what I'm saying is there are different ways that children can learn a foreign language or learn whatever it is. Sometimes they want to do it with a course by asking a person who's skilled and knowledgeable about how to teach it to teach it. Other times they want to do it in their own way. I'm saying, I think most of them want to do it in their own way. They don't want a course. Or at some point they want a course. Let me give you another example. There are a number of people among the people that I looked at who developed a real interest in playing some kind of a musical instrument just by messing around. They were just from messing around with the violin or the guitar or the piano. And they developed a love for it. But then at some point they said, you know, I want now to study this with a master, with somebody who really knows how to play the violin and who can help perfect my technique, or somebody who really knows how to play the piano, who can, they want to go to somebody who really knows the stuff and who they admire and who they want to learn from. And they are willing to make a contract, a sense. It doesn't even have to be a stated contract. I want you to teach me, and my part of the contract is I will do what you're telling me to do. That's an agreement. You can break that agreement anytime you want if it's not working for you. You're not compelled to stick with it. But I think so this is in some sense an answer to mistakes in self-directed education, is to think that there can't be straightforward teaching in self-directed education. There can be, but it only occurs when the young person wants it, asks for it. That you don't have to learn how to motivate children. A good part of typical education is how do we motivate children to get them to want to learn this stuff. In self-directed education, if you're teaching, you're only teaching people who are already motivated.
So, Peter, we are getting a little hungry.
Yes, I don't want to keep you from eating.
We'll take the last question online. She's Andrea Bars from Dresden. I think she should be somewhere here, actually. But she's joining the online. She asked,
yeah, because I have a cold. I have a cold.
Andrea, you there? Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay, so I'm trying to make our school more to open it more and more towards self-directed learning, and I'm not sure if it's gonna work. But the biggest challenge I have is that one of the school founders is saying, but the students want to learn the classical stuff. When they don't want to learn it, it's because they had some bad experience with it, and we need to deal with that. So this is why we still have compulsory classes in our school, and I find it quite difficult because it doesn't seem like scientific or logical argument. It's more like this is my worldview, this is how it is. And I don't know how to answer this.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. I understand that argument, but you know, you're absolutely right in what you're saying. You know, it's self-directed education only if the motivation, the request for it comes from the students. If your school is offering courses in the classics or whatever they're offering courses in, it has to be at the request of students who want this. Otherwise, it's not self-directed. If it is, even if it's offered but not imposed, it can be kind of self-directed, but there is this danger in offering a course in that it leads to the expectation that the staff want you to learn this. It leads parents to say, as my son assumed, because Sudbury Valley at that time had this course in French, my son assumed, well, he ought to take it to please his parents. Well, that undermined his self-directed education. So schools like Sudbury Valley rarely offer courses. Language courses are something that often do occur because it's easier, it's ideal to learn a language with other people, so you can practice it with other people instead of just learn it in isolation, where you might be learning to read but not speak it and understand it. So I think that I agree with you. It's not, I don't know how administratively to solve the problem, but it's not self-directed education if some adult is making the assumption that children really want this course. It's not self-directed education if the children are not clamoring for it, asking for it.
Thank you, Peter, for joining us for that wonderful session and taking all the questions. Thank you all. I can see Derry, Richard, and everybody online. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry, Derry, we couldn't take your questions because we are hungry here. Derry. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all, and it's been an honor for me to be part of this conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great day.